Welcome to the Cannabis Review. This is another episode. Thank you for all the viewers who've been watching the episode so far. It's much appreciated. For this episode, we're delighted to bring you one of the top economists in the world in the cannabis industry. His name is Beau Whitney. He's the co-founder or the founder of Whitney Economics. Beau, how are you keeping?
I'm doing quite well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for coming on. I'm just going to jump straight into it straight away with the guys and kind of jump to our first topic. Is basically the illicit or the pricing and inventory modeling. How is that working over in the States, and how would that work in a European industry?
Well, consumers are extremely price sensitive, and so it's important when you consider price throughout the supply chain that you keep that in mind. Um, a lot of economists think that there's no other substitute for cannabis in the legal market, but they're basically ignoring the illicit market. And so consumers are very sensitive about this price differential. And if you tax too high or if you price too high, then it suppresses the conversion from legal markets to or illicit markets, to legal markets. Now, when you're pricing, um, it's also important to consider who you're pricing those products for, and so it's very important to look at the archetypes of consumers that you have and then price accordingly. It may be that in one neighborhood, even you can have a higher price relative to another neighborhood. That's how price sensitive consumers are, and that's how pricing strategies need to be really localized rather than just implemented on a broader scale.
Okay, very interesting. And do you see much discrepancies as it stands in, let's say, the price per pound in California to Colorado, or even, let's say, compared to Canada? Is there a big discrepancy that you see, and is there a need for a more balanced market price, or do you think that's just going to be capitalism and whoever wins, wins?
Well, right now in the United States, each state has to have their own siloed program. And what that means is that everything that's produced in a state has to be sold there. And so prices can differ from state to state, especially going from West Coast, where it's lower priced, to East Coast, where it's higher priced, until there becomes a national program with that allows for interstate commerce. There's going to be these pricing differentials. What's interesting to note, though, is that one state that's adjacent to another can have a pretty significant impact on pricing. For example, in the state of Oregon, which is located on the western coast of the United States, there was a depression in the pricing due to oversupply in the market, and prices fell as a result. What this did is it pushed down the prices in the adjacent states of Washington to the north and California to the south. So prices will eventually normalize, but right now they're going to vary greatly just because of the federal system that we have in place.
Okay, very interesting. I think the next topic that we're going to go to kind of educate the audience over here in Europe that they might be interested in knowing about is that illicit market to legal consumers. How does that transition take? What are the data and kind of figures that you've seen so far over in the States? Because I think
Yeah,
that's a big one for the politicians to be able to learn and understand that you need to take this black market and turn it into a white market, and what is that conversion rate and how long does it take?
sure. So the rate of conversion depends upon the type of regulatory structure that's rolled out. If you limit the number of suppliers in a given market, it keeps prices high, and then it suppresses the transition from illicit to legal. Um, what's interesting to note, though, is that it takes a while for this transition to occur, and it's really based upon access to the supply. One thing that Canada did that wasn't very, effective was that in some provinces they limited the number of retail outlets, and so without having access to the supply, the consumers remained on the illicit market. So they had a big conversion issue in Canada. In some of the states that opened up a lot of retail outlets and gave consumers more access, then there was a greater and more rapid conversion. One thing that happened is competition entered into the market. It drove prices down, and then it made it more attractive to buy locally rather than on the illicit market. So access and pricing are two fundamental keys to accelerating the transition from illicit market consumers to the legal market.
Okay, interesting. And do you think there's a part that's played in terms of the quality of the product that's available to the consumer in that territory?
To a certain extent, yes. Consumers will pay a premium for product that is tested and labeled appropriately, and they know what they're going to get. But they're willing to pay a premium just as long as that premium is not too much. Whitney Economics has built some models that looks at the illicit market conversion to the legal market and the effect that price has on it. And generally, if there's a 10 or 15% pricing premium, then that's the sweet spot for transition. If it goes above that, it doesn't mean that transitions won't occur. It just means that they will occur at a slower pace. For example, in the state of Washington, there's a 37% tax on the product. It doesn't mean that there's this raging illicit market, though. It just means that people are looking at the price, looking at the products, and then making that decision. They're just doing it at a slower pace than, say, in Oregon, where there's a tax rate of 20%. So it all depends upon the tax. Quality does come into play, but price is king right now when it comes to making that decision on whether or not to participate in the legal market.
Okay, so that's kind of a good example for, let's say, a country like ours, like Ireland, who may be setting up. It's that the politicians and the decision makers to not get too over ostentious on the taxes and to keep it at a fair rate, I think is going to help the industry grow.
It's actually a common mistake to think that you can tax this at any rate and the consumers will participate. It's a fallacy that has been debunked time and time again in the US market.
Okay, excellent. That's very good to know. The last topic I wanted to kind of talk to you about was a big one that I think it's going to be important for any politicians over here who might not have a full overview or education on the industry, and they're kind of going to more look at the numbers. What's it going to bring to the industry? Is it a good or a bad thing? In terms from your educated experience, what do you think the economic impact would look like over in a small country in Europe? And what is the economic impact in territories in the States that you've already been working in?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the perspective I bring to the table is based from North America. But what I've found is that currently, even in just 11 states and 22 additional states that have medical, there's 450 to 500,000 jobs throughout the supply chain in legal cannabis right now. For perspective, in the United States, if there was full legalization, even with some residual illicit market, there would be 1.5 million jobs. And so the more that the market can deploy legal cannabis, then the greater the economic opportunity is. I've met with a lot of economic development commissions throughout the country here, and they're very interested in deploying cannabis as a solution to the economic damages as a result of COVID. And some of the areas that have been hard hit by the US war on drugs that displaced a lot of workers, now they're trying to bring them back into the fray. And so they're not only looking at the plant touching jobs such as retail, growing, product manufacturing, extraction, and the like, but they're also looking at the other economic benefits from the construction of these warehouse spaces, from the ancillary businesses that bring into the operations, the lighting, the soil, the water, the HVAC systems, and the like. So there's a wider spread economic impact that is very, very positive by just setting up the supply chain for cannabis.
Okay, interesting. And have you seen, I know Colorado have a specific principle in place that a lot of the tax dollars go towards the schools. is there other models that Ireland or other EU countries could learn from in terms of how the tax dollars could be distributed fairly?
Yeah, it's quite interesting in that regard because each state here in the United States is this grand experiment, and nobody's really got the model quite yet. But what has worked is when there's been taxes imposed on cannabis that are given to three main groups. One is law enforcement, and they're always in need of greater revenue or greater monies for to support law enforcement. Two is for education, because that's really our future in our societies. And then three for mental health and drug treatment. And so, what the industry here in the United States is doing is they're trying to say, okay, there will be some impact due to cannabis legalization that is negative, but we'll try to address it by funding the very services that can address that as well. So, there have been billions of dollars, literally, just by taxing things at the state level, billions of dollars going into the state coffers. So, one thing to note, though, is that in Oregon, for example, the tax revenues, $100 million a year, is only 0.3% of the state's budget. And so it's not going to be a cure all for budget deficits and overspending. It's going to be a contributor that can do some good if those monies are targeted to specific programs.
Okay, excellent. I think that's a huge amount of information that I think our politicians over in this country will be able to learn from. The very last thing I'm going to leave you with is, what's your future outlook for the cannabis industry, both in North America and in Europe? Do you see there being cross-state competition and brands come to the fore where you'll have your then McDonald's and your Coca-Cola of the industry, and that will then go on a global scale? Or do you see it becoming more of a niche brand operator and there'll be enough room for multiple players across the territories?
I think there'll be plenty of room for many operators in this space. It's important, though, that as this is deployed, you look at the parts of the supply chain that takes the longest to ramp up. So start with the growing first, then your product manufacturing, and then your retail deployment. But what I envision is that brands will prevail. But I've said in many of my speeches that there's three things that will define success in the cannabis space. One is branding, two is scale, and three is supply chain management. And without the scaling and the supply chain management, any type of brand offering will be limited to the extent to which you can support that brand. So it's going to take a little bit of time, but I think that if you add in industrial hemp, which is also considered cannabis, if you if you add that to the adult use and medical cannabis, you've got this global market which will be transformative to the global economy.
Excellent. I think that's been hugely informative for our viewers as of this evening. I'd like to thank you very much for taking your time to speak with us. It's been a wealth of information. I've got a number of notes written down just from our conversation alone, so I'm sure our viewers are going to find that fascinating as well. And I'd love to touch base with you again in a couple of months, and we maybe do an update report, and hopefully Europe will have progressed along a lot quicker than what it is at the moment.
Yeah, I'll be giving some speeches in Europe next spring and summer. I was scheduled for one in Berlin, but I'd be happy to swing by my family's country of Ireland so that we can talk about cannabis as well.
I think I'll owe you a steak dinner for coming on this. So if you ever get yourself in Dublin, I'll be the first person you'll call, I hope.
That's great. Yeah, thank you again for having me. Really
thank you very much. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. Again, we'll be back very soon with Hemp Industry Daily leading reporter. And yeah, we'll chat to you in a few days. Thanks.